Lakota chief sacrificed everything for his white captive. The truth behind Fanny Kelly's 5 months, the sun was just beginning to rise over the wide open land when the wagon train slowly moved forward. The prairie seemed endless, stretching in every direction with no walls, no trees tall enough to hide behind, and no real sense of safety. For many families traveling west in 1849, this land represented hope. They believed it would lead them to better lives, land of their own, and freedom from poverty. Among them was a young woman named Fanny Kelly, traveling with her family and other settlers who shared the same dream. Fanny was not reckless or foolish. She knew the journey was dangerous. Everyone did. They had heard stories of sickness, hunger, storms, and encounters with native tribes. Still, most travelers believed that danger would pass them by. Each day they woke up, packed their wagons, and moved forward, trusting that staying together would protect them. The rhythm of travel became familiar. Slow wheels, tired animals, dust in the air, and long hours of silence broken only by voices and creaking wood. On that morning, nothing seemed unusual. The sky was clear, and the air was calm. Children walked beside the wagons. Women adjusted supplies. Men kept watch, though their eyes had grown tired from weeks of scanning the horizon. Fanny walked near her family, holding on to a sense of normal life even as the world around her felt increasingly distant from home. Then, without warning, everything changed. The sound came first, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet like thunder from a clear sky. Confusion followed instantly. Shouts echoed across the plain. Animals panicked. Wagons stopped abruptly. People turned in every direction, unsure of where the danger was coming from. The open land that once felt free now felt terrifyingly exposed. Lakota warriors appeared with speed that seemed impossible across such flat ground. They moved with purpose and coordination, not chaos. To the settlers, it felt like the world had turned upside down in a single breath. Fear spread faster than words. Some men tried to form a defense. Others froze. Mothers pulled children close. Fanny stood still, her heart racing, unable to understand how the quiet morning had become a moment of terror. The attack was swift. It was not the long battle settlers imagined when they heard frontier stories. It was fast, confusing, and overwhelming. In the chaos, families were separated. Wagons were abandoned. Screams filled the air. Wagons were abandoned. Fanny was pulled away from everything familiar. Her family, her past, and the life she thought she was living. In those moments, time seemed to disappear. There was only fear and disbelief. When the noise finally faded, the silence felt even heavier than before. Fanny found herself surrounded by strangers, mounted on horses, moving away from the broken line of wagons. She did not know where her family was. She did not know if they were alive. She only knew that she was no longer free to choose her path. Her hand shook, her thoughts raced, and her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. She had heard stories of captivity before, but no story could prepare someone for the reality of it. As they traveled, the land seemed to change shape. The plains no longer looked open and hopeful. They felt endless and unforgiving. Every mile took her further from the life she knew. She tried to remember her mother's voice, the sound of laughter from campfires, and the feeling of safety she once took for granted. Those memories now felt fragile, like they might fade if she did not hold on to them tightly. When they reached the Lakota camp, Fanny expected cruelty at every turn. Fear shaped every thought. She watched faces closely, trying to understand what would happen next. The camp was alive with movement. Children running, women working, elders watching quietly. This was not the wild chaos she had imagined, yet that did not ease her fear. She knew she was an outsider. She knew she was not meant to be there. Her arrival drew attention. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with suspicion. She felt exposed, like every part of her was being examined. She did not understand the language, the customs, or the rules that governed this world. The uncertainty was worse than physical pain. Not knowing what tomorrow would bring made every moment feel heavy. Fanny refused to surrender herself emotionally, even though her body was trapped. She did not smile. She did not try to blend in. She cried openly, mourning the life she had lost. Her grief was not quiet or hidden. It spilled out in tears and trembling silence. Some saw this as weakness. Others saw it as defiance. Days passed, then weeks. Time lost its shape. Without clocks or calendars, each sunrise felt both familiar and frightening. Fanny noticed how life in the camp followed patterns: work, rest, meals, and stories shared by the fire. Yet she remained apart, living in a space between survival and despair. She refused to forget who she was, even when it would have been easier to let go. Her resistance made her stand out. She did not accept the situation as permanent. In her heart, she believed that somehow, some way, she would return home. This belief became both her strength and her burden. Holding on to hope required constant effort, especially when loneliness pressed in from all sides. Among those watching her was an older Lakota chief. He did not approach her at first. He simply observed. He had seen many captives before. Most eventually adapted, whether by choice or necessity. But this young woman was different. Her sorrow was deep, but so was her determination. She carried herself with a quiet strength even in moments of fear. The chief understood loss. He had lived long enough to see his people pushed, threatened, and misunderstood. He had seen violence from both sides of the frontier. To him, Fanny was not just an enemy taken from a wagon train. She was a person caught in a moment much larger than herself.
At first his interest remained distant.
Leadership required caution. Showing concern for a captive could be dangerous, especially when tensions within the camp were already high. Yet he could not ignore what he saw. Every day her presence stirred questions about honor, responsibility, and the cost of survival in a changing world. For Fanny, the chief was just another figure she did not understand. She did not know his thoughts or intentions. She only knew that her fate rested in the hands of people whose lives were shaped by rules very different from her own. Fear never fully left her, but neither did her resolve. Part one of her story ends not with answers, but with uncertainty. She had been taken from one world and placed into another. The land, the people, and even time itself felt unfamiliar. What lay ahead was unknown. But one truth was already clear. This journey would change her forever, and the choices made in the days ahead would shape not only her survival, but the lives of those around her. The days after Fanny's arrival in the camp blended together slowly, like watercolors bleeding into one another. Morning came with the soft light of the sun and the quiet movement of people beginning their daily work. Night arrived with cool air and shadows that felt heavier than the darkness itself. Time no longer followed the clear path it once had. Instead, it moved in circles marked only by hunger, exhaustion, and waiting. Fanny Kelly. Each day was a test of endurance. She woke up in a place that did not feel real. Surrounded by unfamiliar sounds and voices she could not understand. The language spoken around her felt distant, like noise carried by the wind. She often sat quietly, watching, listening, trying to understand the rules of this new world without knowing how to ask questions. What frightened her most was not always what happened, but what might happen. The unknown filled her thoughts. She wondered if anyone from her wagon train had survived. She wondered if anyone would come looking for her. At night, she replayed memories of home again and again, afraid that if she stopped, they would fade away. Unlike some captives before her, Fanny did not try to adapt. She did not change her behavior to fit in. She did not hide her grief. Tears came often, sometimes quietly, sometimes without warning. She mourned openly, sitting apart from others, holding on to the pain because it was the last connection to the life she had lost. Some in the camp found her behavior troubling. In their world, survival required strength, and strength often meant acceptance. Her sadness was seen as refusal, and refusal made people uneasy. Whispers followed her movements. Curious glances turned into frustrated ones. She could feel the distance between herself and everyone else grow wider each day. Still, she refused to give up hope. Even when food was placed before her, she ate little. Even when others tried to guide her, she resisted. Her body was present, but her heart was somewhere else entirely. Every small act of resistance became her way of saying that she was still herself. That she had not disappeared. This refusal to break drew attention. The older Lakota chief continued to observe her quietly. He noticed how she walked with her head lowered, but her back straight. He noticed how she flinched at sudden movements but did not cry out. He noticed that even in despair, she carried herself with dignity. These were not signs of weakness. To him, they were signs of deep inner strength. He had seen many changes in his lifetime. The plains were no longer as they once were. New people arrived each year, bringing wagons, animals, and boundaries. Conflict followed wherever paths crossed. Captives were not new to his people, but each one carried a story shaped by loss on both sides. Fanny's pain reminded him of that truth. The chief did not speak to her at first. In the camp, every action carried meaning. Showing interest in a captive could be misunderstood. Others might see it as favoritism or even betrayal. He was careful. His role was to protect his people, not create division. Still, something about her refusal to give up stirred something within him. One afternoon, when the sun was high and the camp was busy with daily tasks, an incident occurred that changed everything. Fanny had been left alone for a short time. She sat quietly, staring at the ground, lost in thought. When others returned, raised voices followed. She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. Fear returned instantly, tightening her chest. The chief stepped forward. His presence alone changed the air. Conversation stopped. Movement slowed. He spoke calmly, firmly, and with authority. Fanny did not understand what he said, but she understood what happened next. The tension faded. People stepped back. The moment passed. From that day on, things shifted. The chief made it known that Fanny was under his protection. He did not announce it loudly. He did not make a public display. He simply acted. When food was distributed, she received her portion. When work was assigned, she was spared tasks beyond her strength. When voices rose around her, they were quickly silenced. This decision was not welcomed by everyone. Some questioned why an outsider deserved such care. Others worried about what it meant for the camp. Protecting a captive required resources, patience, and trust. In difficult times, those things were already scarce. Quiet resentment began to grow. Fanny sensed the change but did not understand its source. She noticed fewer harsh looks. She noticed that people kept their distance. Most of all, she noticed the chief. He did not speak to her often, but when he did, his voice was calm. His eyes held no anger. Though she did not understand his words, she understood his intention. For the first time since her capture, fear loosened its grip just slightly. Still, trust did not come easily. Fanny remained cautious. Protection did not mean freedom. She was still far from home, still unable to choose her future. The chief's actions confused her. Why would someone risk so much for a stranger? Why would he care? As days turned into weeks, she began to observe the camp more closely. She noticed how families cared for one another. She saw elders treated with respect. She saw children laugh, even in difficult conditions. These moments challenged the stories she had heard growing up. The world around her was more complex than she had been taught. At the same time, the chief's position grew more fragile. Protecting Fanny came at a cost. His authority was quietly questioned. Some believed he was too soft. Others believed his actions would invite trouble. Tension simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but present. Leadership required balance, and each decision tipped the scale further. The chief understood this. He felt the weight of his choice every day. Yet he did not change course. To abandon her now would be worse than never helping at all. Honor to him was not about pleasing everyone. It was about doing what was right, even when it was difficult. For Fanny, survival became less about endurance and more about awareness. She learned when to speak and when to stay silent. She learned which paths to walk and which to avoid. She learned that kindness could exist even in captivity, and that cruelty was not always tied to place or people. At night, she still dreamed of home. She still cried when no one was watching. But something inside her had shifted. The world was no longer just divided into good and bad, safe and dangerous. It was layered, complicated, and deeply human. The days grew warmer as spring turned towards summer. The prairie was alive with movement. Grass swayed in the wind, birds sang overhead, and the river reflected sunlight like silver. Yet for Fanny Kelly, the beauty of the land could not erase the fear that had taken root in her heart. Each day was still a test, each step a challenge. She had been a stranger in this world for weeks now, yet she had learned to watch, to listen, and to survive in ways she never imagined. She was learning the rules of the camp slowly. Every family had their own routines, every elder had their own authority, and every child seemed to know a place for themselves that she had never been taught. Fanny observed quietly, careful not to make mistakes that might draw anger. She began to understand that strength did not always come from force. Sometimes it came from patience, from observation, and from knowing when to act and when to wait. The chief continued to watch her from a distance. His decisions weighed heavily on him. Protecting Fanny had already caused murmurs among his people. Some whispered that he had lost the wisdom to lead. Others feared that his actions would invite danger from outsiders. But the chief understood something that few around him could see. Fanny's survival was more than her own. It was a reflection of honor and integrity, values that could not be sacrificed even for the sake of ease or popularity. One morning, Fanny was sent to gather water from the river. The sun was high, and the air carried a warm, earthy scent. As she bent to fill her bucket, she noticed the reflection of her own face in the water. She hardly recognized herself. Her hands were rough from hard work, her skin sun-kissed and weathered, her eyes wide and cautious. She wondered if she would ever return to the person she had been before the capture. She missed her family more than words could express, and the loneliness pressed on her like a heavy cloak. On the path back to the camp, she noticed a small group of women talking quietly. She did not understand their words, but she could see their expressions: concern, curiosity, and a hint of resentment. Fanny realized that her presence affected more than just her own life. She had changed the balance in the camp in subtle ways, and not everyone was happy about it. This realization was heavy, yet it also gave her a strange sense of control. If people were paying attention to her, then she mattered, even if it was dangerous. Back in the camp, the chief approached her quietly. Unlike others, he did not speak in sharp commands or impatient tones. His voice was calm and deliberate. Though she could not understand his words fully, she sensed their meaning. He was not trying to scare her, nor to force her into submission. He was communicating that her life mattered, that she was under his care, and that he expected her to remain herself, no matter the difficulties. For Fanny, this was both confusing and comforting. She had never experienced protection that was neither threatening nor controlling. The chief's actions were not about power over her. They were about responsibility. Slowly, she began to understand that this simple fact would define the next months of her life. She would survive not by giving up, but by understanding the people around her and finding small ways to endure each day. Even with this protection, life was not easy. Fanny struggled with the monotony of daily survival. She had tasks to complete: fetching water, helping with cooking, tending to small chores. Each task required her to interact with others, yet she felt the distance between herself and the camp in every step. Some people were friendly, some indifferent, and some openly hostile. She learned to read their expressions, to know when to speak, and when silence was the wiser choice. The chief's protection was not unlimited. Occasionally disagreements arose in the camp. People grumbled that resources were being used for someone who did not belong. Some believed the chief's attention was misplaced, that he had overstepped the natural order. Each murmur reminded Fanny that her survival was fragile. Even the care she received came with risk, and she was constantly aware that one mistake could undo the small security she had gained. One evening, a visitor arrived at the camp, an outsider passing through, unfamiliar with the routines and customs. Their presence caused anxiety among the people, and tension rose quickly. Fanny noticed how the chief reacted. His calm authority controlled the moment. He moved with quiet precision, giving instructions and ensuring that the camp remained safe and organized. Fanny saw the respect people had for him, even when they disagreed with his decisions. She realized that leadership was more complicated than she had ever imagined. Strength was not only in courage or skill, it was in patience, fairness, and the ability to make difficult choices that not everyone would understand. Over the weeks, Fanny began to learn more about the life of the people around her. She observed their traditions, their celebrations, and their hardships. She saw families sharing meals, telling stories by the fire, and caring for the elderly. She learned that even in a world she did not belong to, kindness existed. She began to understand that people were complex, shaped by their history, their environment, and their experiences, just as she was. Yet understanding did not mean acceptance. Fanny still longed for home. She still feared for her family. She still questioned why she had been taken and whether she would ever see her loved ones again. Some nights she cried quietly, covering her face so no one could see. Her grief was private, but it was also a source of resilience. She held on to her identity tightly, refusing to let captivity erase who she was. The chief noticed these moments. He recognized that survival was more than keeping her safe from harm. It was also about preserving her spirit. He took small steps to support her without drawing attention. When others became impatient or critical, he intervened subtly. When she faltered, he provided space and quiet reassurance. His actions were never loud or dramatic. They were steady, consistent, and deliberate. The more Fanny observed him, the more she began to understand the weight of leadership. She saw how every decision carried consequences, how every act of kindness could create tension, and how courage could be lonely. She realized that the chief was not only protecting her body, he was carrying responsibility for her well-being in a world that would not forgive mistakes. His choices were not easy, and the cost of protection could not be measured in simple terms. One morning, Fanny awoke to the sound of children playing nearby. She watched as they ran across the open field, laughing and shouting, their energy free and unburdened. For a moment she envied their simplicity, their innocence. Then she reminded herself that survival required strength, patience, and observation. She had endured weeks of uncertainty, fear, and loss. She had survived, and she would continue to survive. During these months, small moments of connection began to emerge. A young woman in the camp smiled at her when she completed a task. An elder nodded respectfully when she worked quietly. Even the chief, who rarely spoke, offered small gestures of acknowledgement. These moments were subtle, yet they carried weight. They reminded Fanny that she was not entirely alone, that the world, even in captivity, could offer glimpses of understanding and care. Fanny also learned the importance of silence. Speaking without understanding could create danger. Observing without interfering became a skill. Waiting for the right moment, noticing patterns, and understanding relationships within the camp were all lessons she absorbed quickly. Every day became an exercise in awareness, every interaction a lesson in patience and strategy. By the end of the third month, Fanny had begun to find a strange rhythm in her life. She still longed for home, she still mourned, and she still felt fear. But she had also learned resilience. She had learned to move carefully, to read people, and to rely on her own inner strength. She had learned that even when surrounded by strangers, small acts of kindness, understanding, and courage could create hope. The chief continued to watch her. He understood that protection was more than guarding against harm. It was about supporting survival in every sense. He carried the weight of criticism from his people, the risk of external danger, and the responsibility for Fanny's life. Each day he made choices that balanced compassion with leadership, knowing that his decisions would define not only her experience, but the perception of honor within the camp. As the sun set one evening, casting golden orange light across the prairie, Fanny sat quietly near the fire. She reflected on the months that had passed, the fear, the loneliness, the small lessons, and the subtle connections. She realized that she was changing, not because captivity had defeated her, but because survival demanded it. She was becoming stronger, more aware, and more resilient, even in the face of uncertainty. Part 3 ends with both Fanny and the chief standing at a quiet crossroads. She had endured months of fear and loss, yet she was learning to navigate her new world with intelligence and strength. The chief carried the weight of responsibility and sacrifice, quietly shaping the safety and well-being of a life that depended on him. Neither could foresee what the next months would bring, but both were learning that courage, patience, and understanding were the tools that would guide them through the uncertain journey ahead. The summer heat pressed over the prairie like a warm, heavy blanket. The grass shimmered gold under the sun, and the river sparkled like a ribbon of silver winding through the open land. For Fanny Kelly, each day became both a test and a lesson. Though she remained a captive, she was slowly learning the rhythms of the camp. The patterns of daily life, the small rules of survival, and the delicate balance between caution and courage. Fanny noticed more details now than she had in the early days. She observed how families worked together, how children ran freely but always stayed close to their parents, and how elders guided decisions with quiet wisdom. Every gesture carried meaning. Every movement was purposeful. She began to understand that the camp operated like a living system, each person playing a role, each action affecting another. The world she had been thrust into was not chaotic. It was organized in ways she had never imagined. Though she observed carefully, she remained apart. She had not yet become part of this community, and she was not sure she ever wanted to. Her heart was still tied to the home she had lost. She thought of her family often, wondering if they were searching for her, if they were safe, if they even remembered her face. These thoughts were painful, but they also fueled her determination. Fanny refused to allow despair to weaken her spirit. The chief continued to watch her closely. His care was quiet, deliberate, and careful. He made sure she was fed, that she had shelter, and that she was treated with respect even when others in the camp disagreed. Some whispered about his actions, questioning why he protected a stranger instead of focusing entirely on his own people. Others feared that his attention to her could invite trouble from outsiders. The chief did not respond to these whispers, but he felt their weight. Every day he carried the knowledge that his choices could affect more than one life, and that protection often came with personal sacrifice. Fanny noticed his presence more often now. When she performed her tasks, she saw him observing from a distance, not with judgment, but with quiet attention. She could feel his gaze and knew it meant she was under his care. It was strange to feel protected by someone she barely knew, yet it gave her a small measure of comfort. She began to understand that he was different from the others, calm, thoughtful, and aware of the consequences of every action. One afternoon, as Fanny collected herbs near the river, she saw the chief approach. He did not speak at first. He simply watched her work, observing the careful way she handled the plants, the thoughtfulness with which she carried her tools. Then he handed her a small bundle of herbs he had gathered himself. She did not know the meaning of the gesture at first, but the care it represented was clear. For the first time, she felt a connection that was neither fear nor obligation. She nodded quietly, her heart lifting slightly with the understanding that someone was looking out for her. As the days passed, small bonds began to form between Fanny and the chief, though neither would call it friendship. It was a relationship built on observation, respect, and mutual understanding. She did not speak his language, and he did not force her to learn quickly. Instead, they communicated in small ways, gestures, expressions, and shared moments of attention. Through these silent exchanges, Fanny began to feel that she was not entirely alone in a world that had once felt unendingly harsh and confusing. Life in the camp continued, but the pressure of survival remained constant. Fanny had to complete tasks each day, tending to small chores, helping with food preparation, and assisting when others requested it. Though her work was not burdensome, it required her to navigate interactions with people whose customs and expectations were unfamiliar. She learned to recognize signs of frustration, patience, or curiosity in others, adjusting her behavior to avoid conflict. These lessons were hard, but they taught her the subtle power of awareness. During this time, Fanny also observed the struggles faced by others in the camp. She saw how families dealt with limited resources, how elders guided decision-making, and how children learned patience and skill. She noticed that strength came in many forms, not only physical but also in endurance, wisdom, and the ability to make difficult choices. These observations shaped her understanding of human behavior and survival. and she began to see her own endurance as a form of strength rather than weakness. Even as she adapted, fear remained. She worried constantly about the future, about whether she would ever return home, and about what might happen if her captor's patience or kindness faltered. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake, listening to the quiet sounds of the camp, the distant movement of animals, the gentle rustle of wind through the grass, the low hum of conversation near the fire. She thought of her family often, picturing their faces, their voices, their laughter. These memories sustained her spirit even when everything else felt uncertain. One evening the chief approached the fire where Fanny sat quietly, her mind occupied with thoughts of home. He did not speak loudly or demand attention. Instead, he handed her a small cloth, neatly folded, and gestured for her to take it. Though she did not understand the words he might have spoken, the meaning was clear. Care, protection, and acknowledgement. It was a simple gesture, but it carried immense weight. For Fanny, it was a reminder that even in captivity, compassion could exist. Over time, she began to notice more details about the chief as well. She observed his patience, his steady way of handling conflict, and the quiet authority he held over the camp. She saw how he balanced the needs of his people with the responsibilities he had taken on by protecting her. Every day she gained a deeper understanding of what leadership truly meant: the courage to make difficult decisions, the wisdom to act with care, and the strength to endure criticism and challenge without losing sight of what was right. The bond between them was subtle but real. It was not built on friendship, nor on trust in the usual sense. It was built on mutual recognition. He recognized her courage and spirit, and she recognized his integrity and dedication. Each relied on the other in quiet ways. Fanny learned to read his expressions, to understand his gestures, and to sense his intentions. He, in turn, respected her strength and her refusal to surrender entirely to despair or fear. Yet challenges remained. Not everyone in the camp agreed with the chief's decisions. Some grew frustrated with her presence, believing it distracted him from other duties. Others whispered that he had allowed too much leniency, that he was too gentle with someone who did not belong. These murmurs were subtle at first, but they grew louder over time. The chief bore these pressures with quiet resilience, but Fanny could sense the strain. She realized that his protection came at a cost, and that the choices he had made were not easy. As the months passed, Fanny's understanding of the camp deepened. She learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to act with care. She observed the interactions between people, the small gestures of kindness, and the quiet moments of cooperation. She began to see the humanity in everyone, even in those who had once seemed distant or unkind. Through this understanding, she developed a sense of inner strength, a quiet confidence that she could survive even in the most uncertain circumstances. One afternoon, Fanny was asked to help with the preparation of a communal meal. She worked alongside the women of the camp, learning their methods and rhythms. Though she struggled with unfamiliar tools and techniques, she persisted, determined to contribute. The women began to notice her efforts, offering small smiles of encouragement. Fanny realized that even small acts of participation could build connections and create a sense of belonging, even in a world she had not chosen. By the 5th month, a rhythm had settled into their lives. The days were filled with tasks, observation, and quiet reflection. Fanny had learned to navigate the complexities of the camp, to understand the needs of those around her, and to rely on her own resilience. The chief continued to provide guidance and protection, balancing his responsibilities with care and integrity. The bond between them, though unspoken and subtle, had become a foundation that shaped their survival and understanding. Even as the 5th month drew to a close, uncertainty remained. Fanny knew that her future was still unknown, and that freedom was not guaranteed. Yet she had grown stronger, wiser, and more resilient. She had learned that survival was not only about endurance, but also about awareness, courage, and understanding the humanity in others. She had learned that even in captivity, compassion could exist, and that one person's choices could have a profound impact on another's life. The 5th month drew to a close, and the days were filled with both tension and quiet reflection. For Fanny Kelly, every sunrise brought the same mix of hope and fear. She had endured so much in the past months, learning to survive, to observe, and to understand the world around her. Yet she knew that the time of uncertainty could not last forever. The thought of freedom, of returning to her family, was both comforting and frightening. She had been changed by the experience, and she was no longer certain what it would mean to return to the life she had left behind. The chief remained near her, his presence steady and calm. He had watched her transform from a frightened, uncertain girl into a young woman who understood the rhythms of the camp, the meaning of subtle gestures, and the power of quiet strength. Protecting her had not been easy. He had endured criticism, whispered complaints, and occasional resentment from his own people. Yet he had continued, guided by a sense of honor and responsibility that went beyond the judgments of others. One morning, a group of outsiders arrived at the edge of the camp. They were negotiators, tasked with arranging the return of captives taken during the conflicts of the past months. Fanny had heard rumors of such visits before, but she did not know if they would include her. Her heart raced as the group approached, uncertain whether this would be the moment she had longed for, or a moment of disappointment.
The chief met the outsiders calmly, speaking in his own language and explaining the situation. Fanny watched silently from a distance.
She could feel the weight of the chief's responsibility in every gesture. He was negotiating not just for her return, but also for the safety of his people. His face was composed, but she could sense the tension beneath the calm exterior. The camp seemed to hold its breath as the discussion continued. Finally, the decision was made. Fanny would be allowed to leave, to return to her family and the world she had been taken from. Relief surged through her, mingled with sadness. She had survived, but the months in captivity had changed her in ways she could not yet fully understand. She realized that leaving the camp would mean leaving behind not only the people she had come to know, but also the chief who had protected her, who had risked much to ensure her survival. When the chief approached her to explain what had been decided, Fanny felt a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Though they did not speak the same language fluently, they had learned to understand each other through gestures, expressions, and shared moments of attention. She bowed her head slightly, a silent gesture of respect and thanks. He nodded in return, acknowledging the bond that had been formed through months of care, patience, and mutual understanding. As she prepared to leave, Fanny reflected on the months that had passed. She had learned much about the people in the camp, their customs, their values, and their struggles. She had witnessed acts of kindness and generosity, as well as moments of quiet endurance in the face of difficulty. These experiences had opened her eyes to a world she had never known, and she carried with her a newfound respect for those who had protected her and shared their lives with her. The chief watched as she walked toward the wagons that would take her home. His heart was heavy with the knowledge that he had done what he believed was right, even at great personal cost. His protection of Fanny had not been universally understood or appreciated, and he had lost influence and standing within the camp because of it. Yet he knew that some responsibilities were too important to abandon, no matter the personal consequences. By safeguarding her life, he had upheld his own values, even when doing so required sacrifice. The journey back to her family was long and filled with anticipation. Fanny thought constantly of the people she had left behind and the life that awaited her. Each mile brought a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She was returning to a world she had once known, but she was also bringing with her the lessons, strength, and awareness she had gained during her time in the camp. She realized that freedom was not simply the absence of captivity. It was the ability to carry knowledge, resilience, and understanding into the next chapter of life. When Fanny finally reached her family, the reunion was emotional. Tears were shed, embraces held, and words spoken that could not fully capture the depth of relief and joy. She had been gone for months, and yet her spirit had endured. Her family listened as she recounted the journey, the fear, the loneliness, and the moments of small hope that had sustained her. They were amazed not only by her survival but also by the strength and insight she had gained in a world so different from their own. Even as Fanny returned to her family, she could not forget the chief who had protected her. She remembered his calm presence, his steady guidance, and the courage it had taken to stand for what he believed was right, even in the face of criticism and potential danger. She understood that her survival had depended not only on her own resilience, but also on his dedication and sacrifice. Though he would remain largely unknown in the wider world, his actions had ensured that her story could continue. For the chief, life continued in the camp. He bore the consequences of his choices quietly. Some respect had been lost, and some relationships had been strained. Yet he carried with him the knowledge that he had done what was necessary, what was right, and what could not be ignored. Protecting Fanny had required courage, patience, and compassion, and these qualities define the kind of leader he was. Though the world may not have fully recognized his sacrifice, he knew it had been meaningful and necessary. Fanny's story became a testament to resilience, courage, and the power of human kindness. She had endured fear, isolation, and uncertainty, yet she had emerged stronger and wiser. She had learned that survival depended not only on physical endurance, but also on understanding, patience, and the ability to recognize and accept compassion when it was offered. She had seen that true leadership required difficult choices, integrity, and the willingness to place responsibility above personal comfort. As years passed, Fanny would recall the lessons learned during those months with clarity. She remembered the quiet strength of the chief, the small gestures that conveyed care and respect, and the importance of hope even in the most uncertain circumstances. Though the world around her continued to change, these memories remained vivid, shaping her understanding of human character and the enduring power of courage and compassion. Her story inspired others who heard it, not only because of the danger she had faced, but also because of the humanity she had witnessed in the chief who protected her. People learned that survival and resilience were built not only on personal strength, but also on the careful guidance and support of those willing to sacrifice for the well-being of another. Fanny's experiences became a reminder that acts of courage, compassion, and honor often leave lasting impressions, even if the world does not fully recognize them at the time. In the end, Fanny Kelly returned home changed, but alive. She carried with her the lessons of endurance, understanding, and human kindness. The chief remained a quiet figure in the background of history, his sacrifice uncelebrated by most, yet immeasurable in its impact. Their lives had intersected under extraordinary circumstances, each shaping the other in ways that would endure far beyond the months they spent together.